would you do with $250 million?
I have absolutely no idea. I have no concept of how much money that is. You know, pay off all my bills and take a trip. After that, I don't know. Kids can go to college, no problem. Buy CLTV.
What's the first thing you're thinking about doing now, after you start getting the money?
Nothing. Nothing, really.
It's not going to change your life at all.
Well, I don't know yet. You know, I've never been a millionaire before.
Okay, the first guy, well, he was reacting to what he'd do if he won the current jackpot. He'll buy CLTV. I'd be right in there asking for a raise. You got to know that one. Second guy, you might recognize him from the last time around. There was a record Powerball lottery out there. Mr. Frank Capacey out from Streamwood. You know, he's a difficult man to get a hold of these days. All that money, he's just trying to run from the media. But can you blame him? Really? The last I talked to them, they were off on a vacation. But I also hear he's still out there mowing the lawn at that golf course, that little hobby he has. Like he really has to do anything besides enjoy himself. Well, it's an interesting question. What would you do if you won this amount of money? I mean, can you really comprehend it? Now, these folks down in Ohio, they're going to be splitting it 13 ways. But even so, I mean, millions upon millions of dollars, right? Well, joining us tonight with some lottery spending trivia. First of all, is University of Chicago economist Alan Sanderson. Also joining us, we have on board from the University of Illinois at Champaign, Professor John Kindt. He studied the effects of various types of gambling, including lotteries. And we're being joined on the phone this evening by Diane Balk from the Hoosier Lottery in Indiana, which is one of the states, of course, that does sell those Powerball tickets for Illinoisans who knew they had to drive over there up to Wisconsin or whatever. Well, thanks for being here this evening. Let's start with the fun stuff, because obviously we already know front and center we're going to get into the underside of all of this, but nearly $300 million, Alan Sanderson. Just give us an idea of how one would go about spending that.
Well, it's actually more difficult than one would think. If you wanted to, you could go not far from here to Oak Brook Mall, I suppose, but you'd have to spend $3,000 an hour every hour the mall's open for the next 25 years. That would do it. You could get up. You could get
a
up.
True shopaholic.
Or you could get up every morning and buy a brand new automobile every morning for 25 years.
Now, are we talking junker, or are we talking like Ferrari?
Oh, a good sport utility vehicle.
Okay.
Those are popular.
Okay.
If you're a local sports fan and you don't like the way the Bulls or Sox or Bears are being owned and managed, you could buy one of those franchises.
Could you really?
Run it yourself.
Okay.
They would sell certainly in that range. If you felt very generous and patriotic, then you could decide to pay off the federal government's bills. But you would exhaust that in about an hour, because the federal government spends $250 million to $300 million an hour.
An hour.
So those are your choices.
It's nice to know. Well, you can nix the last one on my list if I won. That's for sure. Let's go to Diane Balk from the Hoosier State there, the Hoosier Lottery. What was the run like this time for tickets compared to the last time around when the Capaceys of Illinois won, which was also a record Powerball lottery?
Well, it didn't take long for the jackpot records to fall.
Yeah, no kidding.
Indiana had about $22.5 million in sales for the Sunday through Wednesday run. And, of course, Indiana also sold the jackpot-winning ticket. But in addition, we had 658,901 lesser winners that awarded. They will win over $4.5 million combined in prizes, including one that was presented today to a Chicago winner, $100,000 winner.
Yeah, that's not exactly just pocket change, right? $100,000, that's pretty decent.
Correct.
Let me ask you this, Diane. When it comes to the lottery and what it does for your state, certainly in times like these, I think it might create some security issues and as people start, running into towns from over the border and trying to get those tickets, and they're lining up for hours on end, I understand, just to get a chance at this. And the odds, I think, are phenomenal in being against you. Wasn't it like 80 million to 1 or something?
The jackpot odds are on the back of all play slips, yes. It's 1 in over 80 million, actually. And we did run special messages reminding folks, hey, keep in mind the odds, play responsibly, don't lose your common sense in all of this.
Is it from what you folks are seeing, is it still a good thing? Because I'm assuming it's set up in your state, so some of these dollars go towards education or whatever you've earmarked them for? 30
cents of every dollar spent on a lottery ticket, whether it's a Powerball ticket or any other kind of ticket sold in Indiana, goes to the state. And the Indiana General Assembly and the State Budget Committee are the allocating bodies. Right now, the primary areas where the money goes is to cutting the license plate tax, reducing that, and also to teachers, police, firefighter pensions, and a capital projects fund. Historically, some other areas over the years, over $293 million for public schools, teachers' retirement fund, and state general fund offsetting the recession, $72.5 million, over $30 million to job creation and economic development.
Okay, so it sounds to me like you folks in Indiana are still seeing this as a benefit rather than something in the negative column because of the things you have to deal with. A lot of folks coming to play, you know, perhaps people even playing that maybe shouldn't be, that kind of thing. Overall, you feel it's benefiting the state? You're still happy with the program?
Well, total sales revenue since the lottery's inception is about $4.8 million. Total prizes paid about $4.8 billion. Total prizes paid about $2.7 billion. Retailer commissions, there are over 4,500 retailers in Indiana, $306.5 million, and transfers to the state almost $1.4 billion. That does not include the most recent Powerball run. We have quarterly transfers.
Okay,
now, obviously, it's a balancing act, and we try and be mindful of that. I mean, we don't want folks to overspend. We want them to well be aware this is discretionary income. This is fun money. We have the Play Responsibly message that's on the back of our tickets. We have the state addiction referral hotline, because if folks do have a problem, we want them to know where to get help. So it is a balance.
And, you know, truly, Diane, you know, Illinois is no different. I mean, we have a lottery here. It might not be Powerball, but, you know, the money's supposedly earmarked for education and, you know, that kind of thing. And there are those who will always argue that it helps the state in many ways. And the numbers that you're touting, it certainly sounds good. But let's hear the other side of this issue from John Kindt, who's joining us this evening from the University of Illinois at Champaign. I know you've studied gambling overall, casinos, you know, what have you. What about lottery? I mean, what's the harm? You buy a couple tickets for a couple bucks, a lot of money comes in, some folks get real happy, real lucky, and, you know, a state makes out with some extra money that they didn't get from regular tax revenue.
Well, one of the first things to remember is that for these this $290 million that are to winners, that takes $500 million in losers. And we know that 10% of the money is coming out of 65% of the public. And we know, the gambling industry's own studies show that they've created 1.5 million new pathological gamblers in the last 3 years.
Now, this isn't just lottery, though. This is overall, right?
Actually, lottery is known as sort of the gateway drug to gambling addiction. And it's known as the marijuana of creating new pathological gamblers. And then you go down to casinos and video slots. They're known as the crack cocaine of creating new pathological gamblers. And each new pathological gambler costs the taxpayers between $10,000 and $52,000 per year. So for each $1 coming in, and we hear a lot from gambling officials, who, by the way, have sort of a vested interest in promoting the lottery. I mean, this is their job.
Okay,
but for every $1 that's coming in, there are at least $3 in social costs. And most economists will argue that the costs are up to $8 to $12 in social costs, increased crime and corruption, bankruptcies, and addictions for every $1 in new tax revenues coming in.
Okay, we're going to talk more about that when we come back. I need to take a break. Those of you at home, well, what do you think? 630-575-TALK is the number.
Better they spend the money on education, whether it's academic or trade. They'll be farther ahead financially in the long run, I think.
Well, there's a woman who says, you know, don't go down to your local 7-Eleven or drive over the border to give your dollar to the lottery. Put it on something that you really need in your life, like a good education. How about if you got an extra buck? So what? And you win. You can look at this a lot of different ways, obviously. And we've got a couple folks on the line right now who have some thoughts as to what they would do if they won. How about Kim from Chicago Heights? Hi, Kim.
Hi. This might sound a little crazy and idealistic, but after paying off my family's bills and maybe putting a couple million in the bank to take care of us in the future, I'd set up a pretty large foundation and scholarship fund for our neighborhood, for the kids who went to high school, you know, in our area and stuff, because there really isn't a lot around here, and it's not really encouraged.
Well, how about that? So you actually would put it toward education.
How much?
I'm saying you would put it toward education.
Oh, yes. Yeah, for, you know, ability, not so much financial need, but kids with the ability who just, you know, can't afford to go, and that way they wouldn't have to work while they were going to school.
Well, that's a nice thought. Of course, I question whether if you actually got all that cash, if you really would follow through.
Well,
but you sound like a good person.
I think my family would agree that they'd be pretty upset at it, but I have a bad tendency to kind of give away money. So
oh, okay.
Not that I have it, but...
Well, Kim, that's a very nice thought. Thanks for calling. Let's go to Ann from Chicago also. Ann, what would you do with the money? Come on, almost $300 million, dear.
Well, first of all, I have 2 children, and I would share them with my children. And of course, nowhere in my life could I spend that kind of money.
Well, you heard what Professor Alan Sanderson said earlier, didn't you? You could spend $3,000 an hour every day at Oak Brook Mall here.
I'm a very conservative person.
Okay, you wouldn't do that.
I would set up a scholarship for for children that can't afford it.
Listen to these people. No, that's really wonderful to hear that. I have a feeling I might be more selfish, but I guess when you have that much, you might as well toss some around and think of some good causes, because as you pointed out, Alan, it's a lot of money.
Well, it is. Actually, it's interesting that both callers mentioned education because that's where the economic return is and has been in our society for 20 years. It's not in other kinds of things. So education tends to be, and not because I have a vested interest in being in that industry, but it has a very high rate of return. Second, if I get back to the comment that Diane Balk made on the air, there is this feeling that the money goes toward education within a state, but there are enormous substitutions. I mean, we know this from other state lotteries.
Well, certainly in Illinois there are.
That money that would have otherwise gone to education doesn't, and then lottery money replaces it. So in this, how much is education really that much better off? Not much. Also, it concerns me a great deal as an economist that even though one can think of the lottery as a voluntary tax, it's nevertheless a tax. It's a tax that's highly regressive, which means it's paid for on the backs of the poor.
How do we know that, though?
Oh, it's easy with zip code analysis and other things. We know where tickets are purchased. The 13 individuals who won today and shared the prize are very typical. They tend to be males of modest incomes and relatively low education, high school graduates. They quit their jobs. If you win $1 million, they'll quit their jobs within 6 months, probably 60 days.
Let me address the education issue. We did a study in Illinois a few years ago, and out of the University of Illinois, which indicated that since the lottery came in allegedly to help education, the funding in Illinois to education had gone down 5% overall in real dollars, and funding to higher education had gone down 11%. And a definitive study done in 1996 by Money Magazine, basically because they're the only ones who would fund such a thing, analyzed every state which had brought in gambling to help education or other charitable purposes, and without exception, in every state which had had it for a while, the funding had gone down. And there were a couple of exceptions, and those were states which had just recently brought in gambling, such as Georgia, and they sell it as, well, we're going to do these Hope scholarships, we're going to help all these people. They're helping the upper class fund education at the expense of the poor. And Professor Sanderson's absolutely correct. This is a regressive tax on the poor. It makes poor people poor. People have compared it to the civil rights movement in reverse. Martin Luther King would roll over in his grave if he saw what was happening to poor people and how lotteries target poor people.
Okay, let's bring Diane Balk back in here. She's still on the phone lines with us from Indiana, the Hoosier State Lottery there. Diane, let's hear a counterpoint to this, because obviously you're one of the lottery officials there, and you folks feel it is benefiting your state and people there.
Sure. Well, there are several things that are at work here, and they're certainly nationally it's a continued study of scrutiny in terms of, in Indiana we have a State Gambling Impact Study Commission. Nationally they're looking at the issue. In Georgia, prime example, I mean, those scholarships are not limited to upper income by any means. It's any student, and they have pre-kindergarten programs that are funded through the lottery. Each state decides how it's going to allocate its dollars, and that's something the legislature does, not that the lottery does. And
Diane,
yes,
these groups that you're talking about that are looking at all of this to make sure it's all on the up and up. I mean,
they're examining the pros and the cons.
Yeah, who are on these? Who are these groups?
Well, the National Gambling Impact Study Commission is a national group where folks were appointed. President, congressional, and Senate members are on the committee, and there's a study that is ongoing now. The state, similar study. Governor has appointed a commission here to examine the impact, and frankly, we think it's a good idea. You know, yeah, in Indiana, in 1988, 62% of the voters voted to repeal the constitutional prohibition against the lottery. And since then, riverboats, horse racing, and of course charity gaming and all of that, all these entities have come forward. So it only makes sense to look at it.
So you're saying people wanted it and they got it. But John Kindt, when you were on our program the last time, we were talking about riverboat gambling, and I think this business about who's actually overseeing it came up at that point. You know, are the people that are looking to make sure that this is all okay and the way it should be and not targeting the poor specifically, are they the right people to be doing it in your opinion?
Well, there's a big conflict of interest. I just testified before the National Gambling Impact Study Commission, and it was addictions, bankruptcies, crime, and corruption right down the line. Unfortunately, there were some pro-gambling people who were appointed to this commission, and they've tried to, I basically say, hide the information, because this industry has a lot to hide. And if we're talking specifically about lotteries, India has just recriminalized the lottery in India. Why? Because it makes poor people poor. They've looked at the addictions, bankruptcy, crime, and corruption. They said, we don't need this. We're a poor country. Why are we making our citizens poor? And that's what we're doing here in the United States. If we look at the Colorado lottery, internal marketing memos that were just leaked indicated that when, quote unquote, you're hooked, and that they're appealing to the quote unquote, lower lobe of the brain to try and get people hooked. They call this system mind sort. That's appealing to pathological and problem gambling. And
I'm sure a lot of people...
good intentions, but that's the natural way that these establishments are going to go, because that's where the money is.
You know, this sounds interesting, but I guess it also makes me feel like, hey, if I go buy a lottery ticket, I'm not worried about this.
Well, actually, one of the other addictions, I don't know if John would agree or not, probably would, people who are hooked are state governments. It's going to be very difficult to unhook them from this life support system because it's a lot of money. And it's an easy way to get it. Nobody is raising much of a fuss about it, and they continue. And some of the ads would certainly be a hard time passing truth in advertising legislation. There's also such a bias. I mean, we're going to celebrate it today around the country. These 13 individuals are going to be televised more often than the other Monica for the next couple days. And what we really ought to do is interview some losers. There's this tendency to focus on things. For example, in the Chicago area, we're very proud of Kevin Garnett. He graduated from high school and now signed a $120 million contract for the NBA. But it's a false lure for young black males, thinking that I don't need education, I can do that too. And we ought to interview the people who don't make the NBA and have very low incomes as a result, or the people who blew $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 over the last week on Powerball tickets, who may have blown their life savings or other important things.
There are stories like that out there, aren't there?
$250 million.
Well, I'd probably have a lot of friends. Well, I know I pay off a lot of bills and share with the family.
You know, I've heard stories over the years, I'm sure you've probably heard them too, that a lot of people who've won these big amounts of money, they did deal with some depression along the way, and that partly because, yeah, they did have a lot of friends. Everybody and their brother wants to be your friend when you've got that kind of money, right? Well, you know, the Capaces of Streamwood, they had calmed down a bit about their Powerball win about a week or so after the fact, and at that point they had to decide how to handle it, and here's like a little bit of what they had to say at that point.
First thing I gotta do is make out a living trust. If I drop dead right now, nobody's going to get nothing.
Yeah, I will.
Well, it's nice to know that all that money didn't cash in their sense of humor, right? Back in May, the Capaces got their lump sum check for $104 million. They went up to Pell Lake, Wisconsin to pick it up. That's where they bought that $1 winning ticket. So again, the question is, what's the harm? $1 ticket? So maybe you buy 5 or you buy 10, but then if you win millions, I mean, your life would change forever. Perhaps it would be a wonderful thing. But then again, what about the bigger picture? Let's go to Steve from Chicago. Hi, Steve.
Well, I think in response to your question, if you put $5 a week into the lottery at the age of 20, by the age of 30, you will have invested about $2,500. Now, if you put that $2,500 in a mutual fund, for instance, you will have over a six-figure income there to provide for you in the event that you retire at the age of 60. That's a significant amount of money.
That's if it's a well-managed mutual fund. Perhaps we should have that little caveat there.
Given the market of the past 50 years with all its ups and downs, that that's the kind of projection. Some people project you'll have even more.
Okay.
Now, secondly, it's a terribly unreliable source of income for local and state government, and that you know, sometimes it's off, sometimes it's up, because there is no guarantee. And thirdly, we're quickly reaching saturation points. You know, this municipality establishes gambling, casinos and whatnot. Well, all of a sudden, the people down the road want one as well, and the people over here and across the state line.
Then nobody's going to any of them, right?
Exactly. And 10 years ago, that was all right because there were relatively few, and this was very profitable. But what happens now? There are only so many people with so much money willing to gamble in this society, and we're finding that there's less and less return on that money. So what are we doing, in fact? You know, to rely on this instead of really substantive industry that produces something within these states and local municipalities, I think is a mistake.
Okay, Steve, do you buy lottery tickets ever? Have you ever bought one?
Oh, no, I have bought lottery tickets in the past, $1 or $2 worth of perhaps, you know, $5 worth over the course of a year. But I make an extremely good income, and I don't do it very regularly. And I think that, sure, that's the kind of people ideally that we would like to see targeted. But that's not the kind of people who gamble. We have people gambling who make very low incomes, who play a lot more money than I ever would imagine playing.
They're paying the food money, in other words.
Exactly, and you saw examples of that. People standing in line for several hours to bet, you know, their last $30 and $40. $30 and $40 to someone who makes, you know, less than $20,000 a year is a lot of money to be gambling away. And unfortunately, I don't think that they realize just how far out the odds are in terms of they're seeing a return on any of that. And lastly, you know, I've read a number of articles that indicate that a great many of the people who won the lotteries in any of the states that are currently available, a large number of them are currently in bankruptcy. That these people, you know, these so-called, you know, wonderful people who've won, well, not only the people who lost, but those people who won, great many of them are miserable today. So I don't think that this, you know, cost-benefit analysis, we're losing a heck of a lot more than we're gaining from lotteries.
Okay, well, Steve, thanks for that. You know, I think you have some folks here that would definitely agree with you. As far as these odds go, something that came across, a guy that does statistics, can't speak now. He's a former professor. He's down in Mexico now, but he's written books on the subject. And he says that you're far more likely to be killed by an animal, electrocuted, die by poisoning, die as a result of surgery, be killed by falling from a bed, or even freezing to death, and win all or part of this particular jackpot we just had. Wow. Who knew? Yeah, John, go ahead.
Actually, you'll be hit by lightning 7 times before you win an average lottery. That's what the odds are like. The other thing is, this gentleman's correct. There was a study a few years ago that showed that I think it was 40% of the winners in one particular state went bankrupt. In other words, after they had gotten the money, they didn't know how to handle it, and 40% of them went bankrupt. And so the state was actually considering establishing a program to help people learn how to manage their money.
Well, you know, this goes against then, Alan Sanderson, that it's so tough to spend this money for the normal spender.
Well, they may spend it. They may not spend it very well. It's sort of it's fairly easy for Dennis Rodman to spend his money, but we would like to think that most of us are spending it a little more wisely and taking a longer period of time. Steve, the caller's absolutely right in terms of rate of return. The old saw is true that lotteries are games for people who are bad at math. And if you can figure out how to get any reasonable financial advice, just putting it in a stock market or some mutual fund, you'll do so much better than buying lottery tickets. It does turn out in these quirks, and I think the Powerball this week was one, that it may have been rational for even the 3 of us to buy a couple lottery tickets.
I had my mom buy me one up in Wisconsin.
Not 10, not 20, or not 100, but a couple, because once the pot gets that big, it does change in mathematical terms the expected value of this thing a little bit.
Yeah. Diane, let's go back to you for a moment. We're hearing a lot of negatives, but I feel you're here this evening to defend what it is.